promoting democracy and defending the rule of law in Africa. Before I begin, though, please allow me to give you a brief overview of our organization. Founded in 2001, Freedom Now is dedicated to protecting human rights and rule of law by working to eliminate the politically motivated harassment and imprisonment of those who peacefully advocate for and exercise their fundamental rights. Since our inception, we have advocated for the release of 93 prisoners of conscience from 10 African countries. These individuals include journalists, musicians, anti-slavery activists, former military officers, and opposition politicians. I'd like to share our experiences in the ways in which African governments have been criminalizing peaceful political participation and expression to the detriment of democratic progress. I'll begin in Rwanda, which provides several examples of ways democracy is threatened. The clearest example, and the one that Freedom Now is most familiar with, is arbitrary detention of political opposition members. Although, please allow me to preface this by saying that arbitrary detention of political opposition members is endemic across the continent, not just Rwanda. We've seen it in the detention of Maurice Kamto in Cameroon and in Bobby Wine in Uganda. I only focus on Rwanda because of Freedom Now's experience in the country. With that being said, let me emphasize that arbitrary detention of government critics in Rwanda is possible because the Kagame administration exercises significant control over the country's judiciary. As far back as 2008, Human Rights Watch reported that judicial authorities operate in a political context where the executive continues to dominate the judiciary and where there's an official antipathy to views diverging from those of the government and the dominant party. Today, there is some debate over how independent Rwanda's judiciary actually is, but human rights observers generally agree that outcomes of politically sensitive cases appear predetermined. In practice, this means that government critics do not enjoy their due process and fair trial rights. Government critics may be arrested without warrants, and the courts play fast and loose with habeas corpus rights. Prolonged pretrial detention is common. Often defendants are not given prompt confidential access to their attorneys, and once we get to the trial stage, other due process issues emerge, such as failing to allow defendants access to evidence against them, coerced testimony by prosecution witnesses, incredibly lengthy and disproportionate sentences, and of course the use of confessions gleaned by torture. One case that exemplifies many of these violations is that of Diane and Adeline Rwigara. Diane is a political opposition leader who in May 2017 announced that she would run in the upcoming presidential election against President Kagame. Within 72 hours of this announcement, alleged nude photos of Diane were posted on social media, and later the National Electoral Commission barred her from participating in the election. On August 29, 2017, Diane, her mother Adeline, and her sister Anne were detained under house arrest in a violent incident where the police ransacked the Rwigara house and badly injured Adeline's leg. No warrant was presented. For 3 days, the Rwigaras were held in handcuffs at their house, and for 3 weeks, the police prevented them from accessing an attorney. On September 23, 2017, the police formally arrested Diane, Anne, and Adeline on trumped-up charges and held them incommunicado. They didn't see a judge for a habeas corpus hearing for a month. When they did, Anne, who was a U.S. citizen, was released, but Diane and Adeline were ordered to remain in pretrial detention, where they remained for more than a year until their release on bail in October 2018. In December 2018, the Rwandan government acquitted Diane and Adeline of all charges. It is our assumption that this was the result of tremendous international pressure. Freedom Now had filed a petition with the UN Working Group on arbitrary detention on behalf of the women. A positive opinion has since been returned. And the US Congress's Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission held a briefing on Rwanda just days before the decision was handed down. Now, imprisonment is the clearest way that Rwanda has targeted political opponents, but the government has used arbitrary detention in a more roundabout way to curtail political expression. I'm talking about the imprisonment of family members of opposition leaders. This is likely why Diane Rwigara's mother and sister were arrested alongside her, but we've also seen this in the case of Frank Rusagara and Tom Byabagamba, two high-ranking military officers who made muted, private statements criticizing the regime in August 2014 and were sentenced to more than 20 years in prison on a laundry list of charges. The thread here is that Mr. Rusagara and Mr. Byabagamba are brother and brother-in-law, respectively, of exiled dissident David Himbara. Given that Mr. Himbara is not physically located in Rwanda, the government has used his relatives as proxies in an attempt to stifle his criticism. The final trend we have identified is the killing of opposition members. We have seen at least 2 FDU members murdered this year, one occurring just last month.
Wow.
There are reports of other FDU members who have gone missing, including the party's vice president, who the government allegedly claims staged a jailbreak and has not been heard from since. It's unclear if the government is involved in these slayings, and we certainly hope not. However, what is clear is that regime supporters have discovered that political assassinations are a useful tool of intimidation. I would like to pivot now to discussing restrictions on freedom of expression. Restricting media is yet another tool that repressive regimes have used to control dissent and silence independent voices. Each year since 2002, Reporters Without Borders has published its World Press Freedom Index. The index ranks 180 countries and regions according to the level of freedom available to journalists. It is a snapshot of the media freedom situation based on an evaluation of pluralism, independence of the media, quality of legislative framework, and safety of journalists in each country and region. In the 2019 index, 30 African countries are placed in the bottom 100. 3 countries, Eritrea, Sudan, and Djibouti, are in the bottom 10. The Committee to Protect Journalists has cataloged the murder of 32 journalists this year. Of these, 5 happened in Africa. Of the 250 journalists imprisoned in the world in 2018, 63 were in Africa. Our own experience in Africa squares with this broad analysis. We've been involved in a number of cases involving persecuted journalists, the most recent being Mohamed Al-Bambari, an employee of Akipe Media out of Western Sahara. In September 2011, he reported on peaceful protests that were ultimately turned into 3 days of violent clashes between 2 neighborhoods in Dakhla after the conclusion of a local soccer game. His reporting included criticism of the Moroccan government's response to the violence. 4 years later, when Mr. Al-Bambari went to renew his identification card at a police station, he was arrested for allegedly participating in the riots. Morocco has repeatedly denied Mr. Al-Bambari as a journalist, claiming he has never been registered as such, and the government does not recognize Akipe Media as a news outlet. This is one of the several strategies Morocco uses to censor its policies in Western Sahara. But I do not want to leave you with a gloomy impression of the state of press freedom on the continent. I'd like to point to Ethiopia as an example of the reforms that are possible. For over a decade, Ethiopia used vague anti-terrorism laws to imprison hundreds of journalists and government critics. In May 2015, parliamentary elections were held in which the ruling party and its allies won every single seat. Months later, peaceful protests in the Oromia region sparked a violent response by the government, resulting in thousands of arrests, more than 800 deaths, and a prolonged state of national emergency. After years of clashes, the government eventually relented to reforms. A new prime minister, Abiy Ahmed, was installed, hundreds of prisoners were released, including every imprisoned journalist, and the country's most notorious jail was shuttered. Things are not perfect in Ethiopia, though. Journalists still are arrested on the anti-terrorism laws, but the general climate of repression has subsided. Now that I've given you a few examples, I'll explain briefly what Freedom's Now approach is to promoting democracy and the rule of law in Africa. Freedom Now provides pro bono legal assistance to prisoners of conscience. Our foremost activity in this regard is filing legal petitions with international legal mechanisms, primarily with a body called the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, a body comprised of 5 experts from various regions. The working group examines our petitions and determines whether there has been a violation of international law in the case. If there has been a violation, the working group calls for the individual to be released and for compensation to be awarded. We find this method to be particularly effective as it establishes an independent, unbiased analysis of a particular human rights situation and gives the country the opportunity to correct the situation. In parallel, we reach out to policymakers and members of the media to educate them about our clients and encourage them to take action. We find our methods to be extremely effective. Of the 93 individuals we advocate for in Africa, 88 have been released. Despite our own successes, much more progress can still be made, and I'll focus on one area in particular that can vastly improve: the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. For those of you unfamiliar with the body, the African Commission was established under Article 30 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and became operational in October 1986. The Commission is tasked with promoting and protecting human rights. It fulfills this responsibility by examining national reports that state parties are required to submit every other year, adopting resolutions and declarations, conducting country visits, and adjudicating complaints submitted by member states, individuals, and NGOs. The Commission has also developed a system of special measures consisting of special rapporteurs to whom specific allegations of human rights violations in specific areas may be brought, and working groups that monitor and investigate specific questions linked to the Commission's work. With the creation of the African Court on Human and People's Rights in 1998, the Commission can also submit cases there. As the primary human rights body of the African continent, the Commission has an essential role to play and has made great strides over the past 3 decades. For example, in its thematic resolutions, the Commission clarified the scope of rights and provided a yardstick for the development of domestic law, in particular in its principles and guidelines on the right to a fair trial and the principles of freedom of expression. The Commission has also urged states to adopt a moratorium on the death penalty, thus supporting the trend towards abolition in Africa. National courts are increasingly influenced by and use the Commission's findings to assist them in interpreting national law. For example, the Constitutional Court of Benin has made numerous references to the African Charter in its cases, and in some instances applied it directly. Despite these tremendous achievements, the Commission can be strengthened through several reforms. First, it must improve its ability to effectively monitor and enforce state compliance. At the moment, the Commission's recommendations are non-binding. Member states should reform the process so that recommendations become binding, and punishment for non-compliance is an action before the African Court. Second, the Commission should improve its interactions with civil society. NGOs can participate in public sessions and submit shadow reports, but these mechanisms are relatively unknown. Only 94 NGOs have accreditation with the Commission, compared to the thousands of NGOs accredited with the UN. The Commission should conduct more outreach to NGOs, especially those on the continent, and educate them of the possibility for engagement. Finally, special rapporteurs and working groups should take a more active role in monitoring human rights abuses. Of the 11 special members, 4 have never conducted country missions, including the Special Rapporteur on Refugees and the Working Group on Death Penalty, Extrajudicial, Summary, and Arbitrary Killings and Enforced Disappearances. These are essential voices and should be given more opportunities to contribute to the dialogue surrounding human rights on the continent. Through these reforms, African countries will make great strides in eliminating arbitrary detention, establishing democracy, and promoting the rule of law. Thank you.
Bravo.
China. I've been to China 4 times, and I worked with some key people there in China towards a program to create 85 million jobs for the Chinese. I was blessed to have that opportunity. They're building a water canal from the west coast to the east coast out to the Yellow Sea. And it will create 85 million jobs and lift 60 million people out of poverty. I want to see the whole for the United States and for Africa in the same process. What I also encouraged, as I was a member of the board of Pan China, which is a very large economic board in China itself, I encouraged at every opportunity that I had the Chinese to invest in Africa. And the reason I did so, in my group, I was the only non-Chinese, is that other nations have ignored the needs of Africa, but they continue to extract the resources and benefit from it in Africa. And they want us to accept that philosophy. I know you don't, and I'm one of those that do not accept that because it's backward. If they want the resources of Africa, they have to have some vested interest by including them in the economic process of Africa. But because of the dissension, the disorganization amongst the African nations themselves, and they want to retain tribalism, we don't get the kind of response we expect coming from them. But out of necessity, those countries within the country will continue the work towards independence. If there somehow becomes, in the very near future, which I think is going to happen, a federal commission will come into existence which will help govern water, electricity, oil, other minerals that relate to the country's benefit. There'll be a sharing of it out of necessity, which will continue to breed greater levels of democracy, where they learn how to work together towards a common good. I'm glad you're familiar with the Little Saigon in Virginia, of how so many people of Asian extraction that don't know each other opened up businesses in one single shopping mall, and they don't speak each other's languages. but they understood one thing: they are Asian. I learned from what they have done. I know you have anyone who gets exposed to it. So the potential as Africa, as a continent, continues to evolve, it will become a reality, maybe not in our time to see it in full totality, but it eventually will become a reality. They're leaving a legacy that our children's children can benefit from. This doesn't exclude white participation, Asian participation. It just says you have to respect my nation. You have to respect my continent. You have to respect us as people, irrespective of the color of our skin. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Dr. Telemann?
I'm not sure which of the questions. I'm going to just pick up on the question of democracy or stability. I think that's one of the questions that you asked. I think that when we look at our continent, it is a continent that is in transition. And also the African continent also has its own history. So it's very difficult to compare it to other parts of the world. A lot of times this question comes up to say, look, Singapore is one of the most developed countries. It's very well structured. Singapore didn't have democracy. In fact, when Lee was the president from 1959, he took power up to, I think, he stayed in power until 1990. He stayed 31 years in power. There was no democratic process. But Singapore is a very well-developed country. So democracy is not a perfect concept. I believe that it's an imperfect concept, but it's the best for Africa that we can use from my perspective. Democracy will bring stability. If we look at what's happening in Africa right now, you have countries that have changed constitution, presidents that have changed constitution. By so doing, they're violating the democratic process. For instance, in Congo-Brazzaville, the president of Congo changed the constitution it was 2016, people died. Burundi, the president changed the constitution, people died. I mean, you can go example after examples where leaders are changing constitutions. And so when there's a democratic system in place, it will bring stability. Because stability, people need to have a certain set of values that allows them to be respected by all the people. And also to abide with those rules. And so the problem we have in Africa is not the type of rules that we have. The problem is that we have a poor leadership, that people who are in position of power are not respecting the democratic process they have. And so to answer your question, yes, I believe that democracy, it's not either or. It's not democracy or stability. But I believe that stability is broad. We cannot reach stability if we have a democratic process in places. So that's what I think.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think, to your point about democracy on the African continent. Democracy isn't one size fits all, right? We keep talking about Africa, but Africa is not monolithic, right? There's 54 countries, there's scores of ethnic groups. So I think democracy will change from country to country, but foremost what's important is respect for human rights and respect for freedom of political participation. It has to come from ground up. People need to have a voice in establishing these democracies.
Thank you. We have room probably for one more question.
No, actually, the question I want to ask, since you knew the answer to your question, I wanted to see what else your question. You mentioned that you were asking these questions, but you already had an answer. So if you can share just briefly and then to get back, if you don't mind, Eric, I'm just asking.
Sure.
Yeah, it's just, let me put it this way. I have an answer, but if I had an answer that would actually help the continent, or if anybody had that one size fits all or whatever answer, then that person would be a millionaire or billionaire actually. But I have an answer which I think could work, but then it has to stand the test of time. And that is, you hit the nail on the head when you gave the example of Singapore. And of course South Korea, and of course China, because if the end goal, I think I don't know if any of you answered that about what the end goal is. Because the end goal, if it's economic development that we're pursuing in having a democratic system, then we don't really need to be pursuing democracy to achieve that. But I think Karl mentioned human rights. So if it's human rights and the dignity of mankind that we're pursuing, then yes, democracy becomes extremely important. But then the question becomes, what kind of democracy? Did Africa actually have a democracy before in its own way? Does Africa need to actually tailor democracy to its own social, economic, institutional, historical conditions? That will become the next question. What criteria do we use to determine what is democracy? A case-by-case basis. There's not one single size fits all, as I think Karl alluded, and I think Bland and you all alluded to that. So the question becomes, how do we, and also is democracy not organic? Does it sort of take shape immediately in every country? I'm throwing that out there, but there's somewhat obvious answers, which is yes, 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 yes. In other words, there's not one size fits all. It's a process that has to be homegrown. It has to be tailored to each specific country based on its own, the country's social, economic, institutional, financial, cultural conditions. Based on that, then you have to start talking, what's the criteria we're using to determine what is is it fair elections? Beyond fair elections, it has to be a process driven, in which case, even if you elect somebody, a politician, and you had fair elections, you need to have information flow, meaning free press, to provide information to the elected. And also, is democracy not indicative, whoever they elect, is that not indicative of the people? Because it's for the people, by the people, and for the people. So if you have a class drunk that you elect as the class prefect of your class, isn't that indicative of you that elected them? So it's a long it's a very deep conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let me respond to that, just in brief. You just identified what democracy is. What I mean by that, the Constitution of the United States is our democratic democracy. It guarantees a Republican way of government. Well, in that process, it allows the Nazi Party to exist in America. It allows the skinheads to exist. It allows the socialist and communist parties to exist. That's what democracy is. It's tolerant of the ill-doings and wrongs of any nation or any concept of someone's thoughts. That's what it is. The seed planted has a great opportunity under the structure of a clause of fairness, when you don't find as much fairness as we would like within the constraints of U.S. law. And you'll see it in our court systems. If a federal agency accuses you of some wrongdoing, just the agency, whether you've done anything or not, they are the investigator. This is without going to trial. This is without going to court, where you cannot exercise your rights, but it's still democratic. They are the investigators. They are the police. They are the prosecutors. They are the judge, and they're the jury. This is the United States. It's agencies under federal guidelines which correct the states themselves. So that's an oversight of the entire development and workings of this nation as a whole. So the Constitution does what? It provides you the opportunity to be tolerant of others' shortcomings.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's very good.
On that note, I know that Dr. Tadema wanted to issue a response to what was said, but I would ask that the panelists also use this opportunity to take a 1 minute to close it out, if you would.
Yeah, I think I'm very concerned about the state of Africa, African countries. Our history is very complex because actually, as I said earlier, I think you missed that. Democracy existed in Africa. It's not a European concept. You can find kingdom in Africa, as I mentioned, the Mosi Kingdom, the Congo Kingdom, the Songhai Kingdom, the Mali Kingdom. All those kingdoms had democratic structure that we built within those countries. But all of it was lost when colonization took place. The restructure of Africa with these new artificial boundaries created a condition where we as Africans have lost so much of what we had, our identity. And as you said, Africa is a huge continent with different culture and different concepts and different values. So we could find similarities, but today we are faced with the boundaries that we have. What do we have? What do we do when you have within one country a different group, ethnic group that did not get along, but they have to exist because they coexist because it's a one nation, one country. And which rules would they be living together? So it has to be, you know, you take in the case of Rwanda, for instance, there are places where 10% of, I believe, of the population is Tutsi and 90% of is Hutu. And so when you have a country that is based in that has that connection, and the elements of tribalism was established, put in that place where people are going to vote, not based on the program of the president, based on the tribal values. So we have a very complex issue that we need to navigate in Africa. But at the end of the day, a system that has allowed a fair decision and people to get in position of power through a democratic process without changing the laws that we have agreed on, the referendum that have been placed in some of these African nations, where we respect the constitution that we have. And so it's an evolving process, but I think it cannot be compared to other parts of the world because of our history. So to conclude, I believe that Africa will succeed. There's a transition, but the leadership for me is the key. We need to have the right people in position of leader. We have seen one leader in one African country, which is Ethiopia. What the President Ahmed has been able to do in 1.5 years, has been able to change that nation. So leadership, us Africans who have come outside of our continent to study and learn, we are the key that can make the difference in our continent.
Karl?
Yes, very well said. I was going to make the same exact point, right? We've seen tremendous amount of change in the African continent over the last year in Ethiopia, in the Gambia, but that momentum needs to keep coming. And African countries can help establish democracy by ending the arbitrary detention of political opposition leaders,